Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Dennis Prager Show. On to happier subjects. Thanksgiving is coming up next week, and there is so much nonsense that is being taught now in your children's schools about Thanksgiving that we decided at Prager University to clear this up, and nobody can clear it up better than Michael Medved, who knows American history so well and who cares about truth. And, of course, he's a very long-time friend and colleague on virtually all the same stations for Salem Radio Network. And he made this video, which had 500,000 views in one day. What's the truth about the first Thanksgiving? Michael, congratulations on a great video.
Well, thank you. It was a great opportunity to be part of Prager University.
Yes, it's a delight to watch you. It really is. So let's begin with the bad news. What are young Americans being taught about Thanksgiving?
Well, the bad news, and it's actually shockingly recent. I mean, Thanksgiving was generally embraced until about 10 years ago. And then they started with the idea that this has to be commemorated as a day of oppression. People wanted to change it to Indigenous Peoples Day, but now they've changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And the entire desire to try to stigmatize the Pilgrims as these mean, oppressive people, and the line generally has been that they were refugees from religious persecution, and then they came here to the United States and began persecuting Native Americans. Now, neither one of those two is true. The Pilgrims did not come to the United States from England. They weren't running away from religious persecution. They were running toward what they thought would be a godly, ideal commonwealth. They came to this country not from Great Britain, but from Holland, where they had been living without much interference for 10 years. The reason they left Holland was they were afraid they were going to be corrupted by materialism and fall short of creating the ideal Christian society that they wanted to create. Now, of course, talking about a bunch of religious conservatives, or radicals even, you could say, with guns, who, by the way, loved their guns, and celebrated the first Thanksgiving with shooting contests, which, again, I'm very surprised that our friends over at the NRA haven't picked up on that.
It's amazing the stuff that you know. So what happened at the first Thanksgiving? What's myth and what do we know?
Well, the myth is that it was necessarily at the last part of November. First of all, it was out of doors, and nobody can be outdoors in Massachusetts in November. I don't know if you've been there. It almost certainly was in October, and it was also almost certainly associated with the Jewish Harvest Festival of Sukkot, of Tabernacles. And one of the fascinating things, one of the best books written about the Pilgrims is a new book, came out a couple of years ago by a Cambridge historian named Nick Bunker, which got a lot more attention in Britain than it did in the United States. The book is called Making Haste from Babylon. And he says that they modeled the first Thanksgiving over Birkat HaGomel, which is the traditional Jewish prayer that Jewish people, as you know very well, Dennis, say to this day after you've gone through a difficult journey and you've been safely delivered. And part of the reason that they said they had this celebration at that time was they had just gone through a winter where literally half the people and the majority of the women in the community had died. And they shared the celebration. There were about 50 of the Pilgrims left, and there were 90 warriors, all men, who came from Massasoit, who was the local Indian honcho. And they didn't come empty-handed. They brought about 5 dead deer that they had recently hunted, which the Pilgrims helped to cook. And that was the bulk of the meat on the menu. Plus, they had fish, and they had beer, of course, which was very important to the Pilgrims. And they celebrated, and it says they lasted for about 3 days celebrating together with their Native American neighbors. And one of the things that they engaged in was these contests of skill with their firearms, because they loved their firearms. It was life itself. It was their survival depended on it. And, of course, their Indian neighbors were fascinated by the guns as well.
Now, who recorded this?
It's recorded by two different eyewitnesses. One is Edward Winslow, who was there, a member of the band, and then William Bradford. And this is, again, one of those things that I've just been, because of what I'm writing right now, I've just been digging deeper and deeper into it. William Bradford spent his first several years in Massachusetts teaching himself Hebrew. And it's what's amazing to me is we're talking about 1621, 1622, and that this is a very, very long time ago. We're talking about 400 years ago, almost.
All right, hold on. I want to get back to 400 years, but it's imperative that I remind people I'm speaking with Michael Medved, my wonderful colleague, and in radio, and the presenter of the latest video at Prager University, What's the Truth About the First Thanksgiving? Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here. Delighted to be with my friend and colleague, Michael Medved. One of the ambitions of Prager University and its videos is to reclaim the American past because it's been so sullied. It's one of the most painful aspects of being an American today, to see American history, which has, of course, it has its flaws and its terrible aspects. Of course, how could it not? It's made up of human beings. But you have to compare it to other nations, not to some utopian idea. And so even Thanksgiving has now been revised in people's education and perceptions. So to make it straight, we have Michael Medved's video up this week. What's the truth about the first Thanksgiving? And it's terrific. So you were talking about Bradford 400 years ago. Go ahead.
Well, it just that this was somebody who saw his purpose in life to try to discern the hand of God in human events. Which,
by the way, Michael Medved tries to do too.
I do. My book, The American Miracle,
yes,
which is recently
just come out in
paperback.
And I heartily recommend it to my listeners.
Thank you, because one of the chapters is about the Pilgrims and the truth about the Pilgrims that they were looking for, and basically looking for various signs from the Almighty. And one of the signs was they weren't even supposed to land in Massachusetts. They were aiming for what they called Virginia at the time, because there really wasn't much in the way of settlements, just this struggling little outpost in Jamestown. And they were heading for an island called Manhattan. And it's amazing to think if they hadn't gone 250 miles off course, which is pretty tough sailing. I mean, that's far off course. When they finally arrived in Massachusetts, they tried repeatedly to sail down to the south and to the west to reach Manhattan Island and the vicinity of current-day New York, obviously. But the winds were against them and the tides were against them, and they decided it was God's will that they should be right there. And then they spent almost a week searching for some place they could land where they wouldn't starve to death and freeze to death immediately, because they landed in November of 1620, and it was cold and it was miserable. And again, these two guys tell this story, and it's the same story of riding in a little boat that they took from the Mayflower and scouting for the ideal location. And all of a sudden, in the darkness, because they had not found any place even to spend the night, there's a giant wave that came up, and it sounds like a tidal wave of some kind. And they thought it was going to smash their boat, and the wave deposited them on a little island where they huddled at night and spent the night. And then when dawn came up, they saw the perfect location, which was right across the bay, and that was Plymouth, and that was where they built their home. Here's the amazing thing. That had been a substantial Indian village for the Patuxet Indians, who had died, all of them, about a year and a half before from disease. Nobody knows exactly what disease. People suspect either hepatitis or smallpox. It may have been chicken pox. But in any event, there was only one survivor of that village. And he survived because he had been captured in slavery about 10 years before. and captured by the Spanish, sold to the Spanish. He was liberated by Franciscan monks, became a Christian, then went to England and tried to hitch a ride back eventually to his old village. When he came back, he found that the village was deserted, everyone had died, and so he lived in the woods, sort of seeing himself as a ghost, the only survivor of this, what had been a town of several hundred people. In any event, it was there that the Pilgrims came to settle. And by the way, this is the kind of people they were. They recorded at the time in the diaries they were keeping, they saw that there was some stored corn, which they used to keep them alive. And they wanted to find the Indians, who of course were dead at the time, to try to pay them for the corn that they were taking. In any event, they became convinced that this was Providence. So did this Christianized Indian, who was literally the one single person in this whole vast continent who was best situated to keep the Pilgrims alive. He's referred to in history as Squanto. His real Indian name was Tisquantum. And the story of the Pilgrims being astonished that they meet this Christian, English-speaking Indian who then moves in with them and helps them negotiate a treaty of peace with the surrounding tribes. All of that is so unlikely when you think about it.
Unlikely. I think that the odds against it are mathematically equivalent to impossible.
Yes, and this is exactly what William Bradford considered in his study in this home. He was the longtime governor of Plymouth Colony. And as I mentioned, in order
All right, hold on. I got one sec there. I got to take a break. Is that correct, Sean? Yes, okay. Everybody, we're going to take a quick break here. I tell you, I was listening to Michael, and all I was doing is smiling the entire time. That's why you got to read his book, but of course, the American Miracle, and see his video on Thanksgiving up at PragerU. And I will return with Michael Medved. The story is truly unbelievable and inspiring. Thanksgiving with Michael Medved. Back in a moment. Hi, everybody. You know, I talk about America's problems a great deal. So it's always a joy to remind you of the great aspects of the country. Thanksgiving is one of them until it, too, has been made war on in some way by sullying its reputation. Oh, it really didn't happen, and so on. Actually, the truth, as Michael Medved knows better than almost any of us, is actually better than what we were taught traditionally. Michael Medved has the latest course for Prager University this week, What's the Truth About the First Thanksgiving, and of course his great book, The American Miracle. Michael, why was I not taught about Squanto, or Tisquanto, the official name? Well, this story of the only human in the Western Hemisphere who spoke English showing up at the exact spot the Pilgrims arrived is as close to an obvious miracle as anything I know of.
Well, and not just that. The fact that they arrived and had established themselves in the village in which he grew up, which was totally abandoned. It was like a ghost town because everyone had died of this devastating plague. And by the way, the plague, one of the stupid things that people talk about is, they used deliberately infected blankets and they tried to use germ warfare. People didn't even understand germ theory at the time. And this is not who the Pilgrims were. One of the things that I do in American Miracle is I write down some of the things that they wrote about our brother Indian, using that term. And there was not, and it's true that later on there was some warfare and there were cruelties back and forth. But the idea that these were people who came to the New World in order to achieve conquest is utterly wrong. What is so fascinating about this is that the war on Thanksgiving is really a war on gratitude. And, the opposite of gratitude is anger, which I think we have too much of in our country right now. And, again, if you choose for your children Do we want our children to grow up to feel gripes or gratefulness? Do we want them to be grateful or angry?
And your
I think the answer's
video,
obvious.
yes, it is, and your video will be a terrific Thanksgiving gift. Folks, you have a sort of obligation to yourself and to the country to see it. Michael, congratulations. You do wonderful work for our country.
Well, thank you. God bless you. And by the way, that X chair is terrific, isn't it?
Yes, it is. My man, Michael. All right, everybody, thanks for listening.
Food, football, and oppression. That's what Thanksgiving has come to mean to many Americans. Back in 2007, Seattle public school officials made national news by describing the holiday as a time of mourning and a bitter reminder of 500 years of betrayal. This new narrative describes the Pilgrims as arrogant oppressors who fled persecution only to become persecutors themselves, depriving Native Americans of their land and their lives. But this is wrong on every count. First of all, the Pilgrims didn't cross the ocean to flee persecution or even England. They'd been living for over a decade in Holland, Europe's most tolerant nation and a haven for religious dissenters. Free from interference by the Church of England, they feared seduction, not persecution, worrying that their children would be corrupted by the materialistic Dutch culture. That's why they risked their dangerous 1620 voyage to a wilderness continent, not because they were running from oppression, but because they were running toward holiness, fulfilling a fateful mission to build an ideal Christian commonwealth. They initially planned to plant this model society on the wild, wolf-infested island known to natives as Manhattan. But winds and tides blew them 250 miles off course, dumping the Mayflower on the frozen coast of Massachusetts. Somehow, the Pilgrims saw their dire situation as a demonstration of providential power, especially after a giant wave picked up the flimsy boat of a scouting party on a stormy December night. The turbulent sea then deposited them safely, miraculously, on a little island within sight of the ideal location for their settlement. It was a deserted Indian village with cleared land, stored supplies of corn, and a reliable source of fresh water. No, these supposedly cruel conquerors never actually invaded that village. Instead, they expressed a fervent desire to pay the natives for the dried corn they found, if only they could find someone to pay. But the former inhabitants had perished during 3 years of plague, probably smallpox, that immediately preceded the Pilgrims' arrival. One of the few survivors of that devastation turned up several months later to welcome the English newcomers. Against all odds, he proved to be the single human being on the continent best suited to help the struggling settlers, since he spoke English and had already embraced Christianity. His name was Squanto, and he had grown up in this very village before a ruthless sea captain kidnapped him as a boy and sold him into slavery in Spain. After 4 years, he was freed by kindly monks, then made his way to England, and finally sailed across the Atlantic, only to find his friends and family all wiped out by disease. Over the next few months, Squanto helped the English newcomers plant crops and negotiate a friendly trade agreement with the region's most important chief, Massasoit. No wonder Pilgrim leader William Bradford called Squanto a special instrument sent of God for their good. The celebration, later known as the First Thanksgiving, actually involved a 3-day harvest festival in October, apparently inspired by the biblical holiday of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. 90 hungry Indian warriors joined the 53 surviving Pilgrims for this occasion. Nearly half of the colonists had died during the brutal winter. The Englishmen provided some vegetables, fish, and perhaps wild turkeys, while the natives brought 5 recently hunted deer as house gifts. The preferred sport on this occasion wasn't football, but shooting, with settlers and Indians sharing a fierce fascination with guns. Though these hardy pilgrims loom large in the American imagination, they never built their Plymouth settlement into a major colony. In nearby Boston, the later colony of Massachusetts Bay grew so much faster that it swallowed up the great-grandchildren of the Pilgrims in 1691. But the sense of purpose of the original Pilgrims left a permanent imprint on the national character. They maintained unshakable confidence that God protected them, not to grant special privileges, but to impose special responsibilities. They saw themselves as instruments, not authors, of a mysterious master plan. Today, with our continued blessings so obvious and so overwhelming, the only reason to treat this beloved national holiday as a time of mourning is that some foolish Americans actually think that's a good idea. The Pilgrims knew better. They understood that people of every culture and every era can gain more from gratitude than from guilt. I'm Michael Medved for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To ensure that millions of people watch this and other PragerU videos, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
Glenn Beck.
The Blaze Radio Network.
Johnnie Moore, good friend of the program and the author of the book The Martyr's Oath, joins us now. He is the guy who provided the inspiration to start the Nazarene Fund, and we welcome him to the program. Hi, Johnnie. How are you?
Hey, Glenn. I'm good. Good to hear your voice.
So I don't know if you saw this on CNN yesterday, but CNN is starting a series now. They've been doing an investigation for a year, and they found out that slaves are still being sold in the Middle East. They didn't touch on the Christian slaves. They just touched on the slaves in Libya. But I'm hoping that they will find the enormity of the problem soon, that it's not just happening in Libya.
Yeah, no, the situation has changed, but it hasn't improved. You know, ISIS taught these terrorists all around the world in different places new brutality, new techniques, and it persists. It's not what we were seeing. You know, the beheading of Christians on live television. Now it's back in the shadows. But in Nigeria alone, you know, Boko Haram, which pledged its allegiance to ISIS, I mean, they killed more Christians last year than ISIS did in Syria. I mean, this is still a very, very intense situation. Not to mention, you know, these communities still need to be rebuilt. You know, and Glenn, I got to tell you, I mean, I was thinking really, really small until I got on your radio program. You know, and because of the Nazarene Fund and your vision and your voice, I mean, a lot of people were helped, but we can't let up now. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
So, Johnnie, you went over, and this is kind of what your book is about. You went over with kind of a comfortable Christian attitude, an American Christian attitude, and you met these people who are living. We are seeing first century kind of persecution of Christians. They are now the most persecuted people on earth, and nobody's even talking about it. And you saw it firsthand, and it kind of shook you to your core, did it not?
No, it changed me. I mean, I totally changed my lifestyle. I changed my job. I changed how I was investing my time. I mean, I could not have a good answer to this question. You know, what was I doing when this was happening in history? And, you know, with this latest, you know, book, The Martyr's Oath, you know, we went around to 30 different countries, sent research teams everywhere to document the firsthand accounts of persecution. And I was even surprised at what was happening in countries I barely knew anything about. You know, and then, Glenn, we have allies like Turkey. You know, Turkey is a country where last year, the Directorate of Religious Affairs appointed an imam to the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia was for 1,000 years the most important church in Christianity, and it has been a museum since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But last year, Turkey, under the nose of the whole world, appointed an imam to supervise one of history's most famous Christian churches. They also confiscated 50 Christian holy sites. And so it's not just about the imprisonment and beheading and the torture and all these things, the thousands of people that are affected by that. Countries like North Korea, where 70,000 Christians are in prison. It's also this subtle discrimination and prioritization and supremacy of Islam that's erupting, all around the world. And we have to keep pressure on people. We have to keep telling these stories, and we got to help them too.
Tell me the stories that you found in your research.
Well, one that I can't get out of my head. I mean, I met a family that had fled Syria. I was in a neighboring country. They were sitting across the table from me. They had converted to Christianity, and because of it, their jihadist relatives in Syria were threatening their lives. They sent them a letter, and the letter literally said, "We know where you are. We're going to come find you, and we're going to crucify you like you're Jesus." And my jaw was on the floor already. But then they told me what they did. They said, "We wrote him back." They wrote the jihadist relative back, and the letter they said, please come find us. We're ready to die for our Jesus, but please don't crucify us. We're not worthy to die the same death. And I just couldn't. I just didn't know a faith like that. I mean, I see it in the Bible, right? But I don't see it in our real world. And, I found that as much as we've helped these people, and you know this more than anyone, Glenn, I mean, this audience saved the lives of thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians. But as much as we try to help these people, I find that they help us. They show us what's really important. They show us how to live because of their willingness to die.
So what causes that, or what have we lost, Johnny, to where, because I can't imagine, I don't know a single Christian that I think would sit down with the family and say, let's write them back and say, please, just don't crucify us like our Lord. You can crucify us upside down, but we're willing to do that. But just don't put us in his category. I don't know a single person here in the United States that it could sit down with a family and really say that. What happened? Yeah, what happened to us? Where's the disconnect?
And I don't know that I could say it, and it causes me to look inside of my own heart. I mean, that in my reading of the Bible, I mean, you see a lot of this, right? I mean, the New Testament is all about persecuted people. They're either being persecuted or they're helping those who are being persecuted. And I'm just convinced that we cannot have a real faith life unless we're close to people whose faith costs them something. And this is the most subtle thing, because it gets at our character, and we don't even know it's getting at us. But it changes us, and it changes us in profound ways. We don't care about truth anymore because truth doesn't cost us anything. We don't forgive our enemies. We don't forgive our political opponents, much less our enemies, because we don't have to. And yet the Coptic Church, which has endured terrible persecution in the last 6 months, multiple suicide bombings, a bus of children massacred, and yet the Coptic pastors all across Egypt publicly said that they forgive the terrorists that killed them. I mean, it's like crazy until you read the Bible, and then it's like ever present. There's a role for government, it's to keep nations secure, and there's a role for the church and for people of faith, and that is by our compassion, by our service, by our testimony, we cause less problems in the world for governments to solve. We work on hearts, they work on security, and our persecuted brothers and sisters, I mean, they have a faith we need to learn from. Boko Haram went after this mom that we interviewed, and they were trying to behead her after they beheaded her husband and her children, and they were demanding that she say Allahu Akbar. They were trying to convert her on the spot, probably to make her one of their wives. And you know what she did, Glenn? She said to us with a raspy voice, because she nearly died, she said, every time they demanded that I say Allahu Akbar, I looked back over my shoulder at them and I screamed, Jesus. She was fearless. She has a real faith. And I think a lot of us sort of, we have a fake faith sometimes.
Wow. I will say, though, my iPhone 10 has not been delivered yet. It's been delayed, and I'm very upset about it.
He's been talking about it all day. So Johnnie, I can't even get to the beheading part and see that kind of faith. I'm struggling now with faith, not my faith, but with religion and religionists, that we don't believe in Jesus enough to turn the other cheek. We don't believe in the message of the gospel, which is what Gandhi and Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King lived. We are escalating the trouble by not being messengers of peace. And it strikes me that we don't really believe it. We don't really believe that it works. When push comes to shove, no, it's the sword. It's not the knee.
Yeah, and it says something about us at a deep and profound place. And the only way I know how to change is to meet those people who don't have what we have. They don't have our religious freedom. They don't have our wealth and our prosperity. They don't have our security. They don't have any of these other things. But what they do have is their faith. And their faith is all that they need. And this is why, for 2,000 years, we've told these stories. In early America, every American home had a Bible, a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, and they had Fox's Book of Martyrs. And there's no surprise that there was something unique about the Judeo-Christian foundation of this country, because it was, we were close to people whose faith meant something to them. They expected they would have to sacrifice their lives, their money, their reputation, something. They would lose something if they were faithful.
And that is what this book is, The Martyr's Oath. It is a new version of Fox's Book of Martyrs. And Johnnie Moore is its author. Thank you, Johnnie. God bless you.
Thank you, Glenn.
You bet.
Glenn Beck.
The Blaze Radio Network.
The original Antifa groups in Europe formed to combat this man, Mussolini. Antifa has been around for a really long time, even here in the United States. But what does it actually mean? We have to start here. Antifa. What is it? Well, Antifa is actually just a shortening of what they actually stand for. They are anti-fascist. That's what Antifa means. We know that Antifa's primary goal is to confront fascism wherever they detect it and to shut it down. That's why you'll hear the phrase, shut it down. You'll hear that a lot. We know that they are not a national organization, but a loose association of dozens of individual organizations, a little like the Tea Party was. They're mostly in larger cities around the U.S. They don't have a national headquarters or a national leader. In fact, a lot of Antifa members think of themselves as just a grassroots movement. So they're organized locally to oppose fascism. But what do they mean by fascism? Well, these guys, spooky dudes. The original Antifa groups in Europe formed to combat this man, Mussolini, and when he rose to power, Adolf Hitler. Bad guys. I want to be a part of a group that's fighting against those guys. Antifa says they're fighting the same form of fascism in America today. However, their definition of fascism has expanded over time. For instance, this is how Yvette Falarka defines it. Now, she's the leader of an Antifa group in California called By Any Means Necessary.
What is a fascist?
So a fascist is someone who's organizing a mass movement that's attacking women, immigrants, black people, other minority groups in a movement of genocide. That's what a fascist is.
Okay. So it's someone who's committing violence?
And it's someone who's committing violence and who's trying to organize other people to commit violence.
Some elements of the description were part of historic fascism, mainly the genocide in Nazi Germany. But today's Antifa opposes anything they define as oppressive. That's a problem. Notice she also defined a fascist as someone who's committing violence and who's trying to organize other people to commit violence. Well, Yvette, by your own definition, you would be a fascist. Watch.
Are these people going to get off our street? We don't have to give a speech. Need to go, boy. Hey, say we should. Be nice. Come here now. Off our street. Get the off our street. We're not here to you. Sir, please. I'm just here to protest. Please. Stand down. Get out. Get back.
Flarka helped organize the Berkeley protests, and she says activists ought to copy its tactics for other speakers and events around the country.
Yvette is facing charges for that attack and another violent encounter in September of 2017 in Berkeley, California. She is also a teacher at, get this, Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School. Now, historic and American Antifa members do have one thing in common, and that is violence. They both engage in violence. Mussolini was an interesting guy. He invented fascism in 1919 when he founded a political party called Partito Nazionale Fascista. I'm butchering that, and all of my wife's relatives are rolling in their grave right now. But I ain't Italian, so here's what I do know. Fascista descended from the Latin word fasces, which is a bundle of sticks that the Romans used to symbolize their empire. In fact, we have them on either side of the House of Representatives. You can't take a bundle of sticks if they're all bound together. You can beat anyone. If you just have one stick, it can easily break. Mussolini thought it was his destiny to become a modern Caesar. His party, known as the Black Shirts, terrorized and assaulted their political opponents. They killed 2,000 of them between 1920 and 1922. Then comes Franco. A decade later, Mussolini and Hitler ruled over their own fascist regimes, and they helped this guy, Francisco Franco. He became a fascistic dictator of Spain. Their brand of fascism exalted the nation and the race above all else. The individual didn't matter. Only the state mattered. The dictators had unlimited authority and eliminated any opposition. They used parades and rallies and flags and media to spread the nationalist propaganda. This is what Antifa claims to be fighting against today. We saw in 2017 that they often use violence to do their work. Their violence is a conundrum for many on the left and in the mainstream media. On one hand, who doesn't want to be against guys like this? And unfortunately, a lot of people in Antifa and in the press have a real distaste for President Trump. They also cheer Antifa for confronting white supremacists and neo-Nazi groups. And it's hard not to cheer, who are blatantly offensive to most Americans, regardless of being on the left or the right.